that would be likely to produce them. They, of course, we had no antibiotics. There was no sulfa. And a pneumonia patient was usually given just all of the fresh air that they could possibly get into the room, even if it was down to zero. And that had been true for quite a good many years. And so when I graduated, I went to Albany to take my state boards. Now, beginning in 1909 was the beginning of state boards, medical state boards in New York State. No medical doctors had even had to take state boards previous to that time. And beginning then, the medical doctors and osteopathic physicians, too, all had to take the same examination. There were either 6 or 8 exams that we had to take. Now, materia medica was not included in the examinations. Even the medical men didn't have to take an examination in that. But we all took the same examination. But when we graduated, or when we were licensed, we osteopathic physicians were not at that time allowed to do anything in our offices other than what we could do with our 10 fingers. If we lived to the letter of the law, we couldn't open a pimple or a boil. We could just do what we could do with our 10 fingers. So, when I went to take the state boards in Albany, the first morning, there were nurses and doctors all taking the examination. The nurses were on one side of the room, the doctors on the other side. We were all taking that first morning an examination in anatomy, but it was not the same examination. And if a doctor made the mistake of getting the nurse's paper or vice versa, why, it would just be thrown out and you'd just be out of luck. Well, that whole morning, I think every proctor that was in that room would stop by my desk and they'd say, "Oh, you have the wrong examination paper." And I said, "I'm taking the medical examination." I was the only woman taking the medical examination. "Oh, I beg your pardon." And they would go on. And then pretty soon along would come another one. And but after that, there was not the difficulty. But that morning we were all taking the same examination, or taking an examination in anatomy. Of course, they were much simpler than ours. You might like to have taken it. Right. And we were allowed to take examination in anatomy and physiology at the end of our, I believe it was at the end of our sophomore year, which was a good time to do it. But then everything else had to be at the end of our senior year. And then came the waiting period. This was in June that we took it, and then we had to wait until probably about August before we would receive word whether we had passed or not, and would receive our license to practice. So in August of 1925, I started in practice in Olean with my brother-in-law, John Henderson. There had been a woman doctor in the city before that. She hadn't left a very good reputation, that is, with the profession. She felt that because she was a woman, that she should have special privileges. If somebody waited at the hospital for the use of the operating room, why the men should wait and she should have first privilege, which of course was no way for her to have been. We had one professor in college who had been opposed to women in the profession. Dr. Andrew Taylor Still, the founder of osteopathy, was very much in favor of women in the profession, which has always made it easy for women to enter the colleges, the osteopathic colleges. But anyway, this one professor, the two sororities had a meeting one night and invited him to speak to us. And we asked him to talk on women in the profession and why he had been opposed to it. And so when he came to speak, we were in a room, so that he was standing in a corner to speak the farthest from the door. And he said, now, I'm not saying this because you have me corralled in this corner, but he said, I am changing my opinion of women in the profession. He said, as I look around here tonight and see you girls so attractively dressed, he said, that is one thing that is changing me. He said that some of the early women of the profession unsexed themselves. He said, you look at their pictures, they wore a stiff neck collar and a man's coat, a tie like a man would wear, and he said, I never liked it. But he said, that is changing. So we had a very interesting evening.
I bet you did.
And afterwards, when I did look at some of the old pictures, and I realized that. And I realized, too, that there were some of the women who did exactly as this woman in Olean had done. Expected that because she was a woman that she had special privileges. I never felt that way. I expected to be treated as a lady should be treated. But I never expected any special favors. I just took my turn with the other physicians, and I think it worked well. Well, so we continued to practice there. I did with your Uncle John. And then during those years, he built a cottage up at Cuba Lake. And the family had such fun up there. And also, I shall have to tell this because the rest of the family will be very much disappointed if I don't bring in something about the Christmases that we had. Beginning about that time that we started having practical jokes. Of course, we'd all grown up, you know, now. That is my particular family. Mm-hmm. We were adults.
Some of you never grew up, but...
Well, thank you. But anyway, in 1925, the year that I graduated, my Aunt Lucy passed away in Little Valley. And her things were supposed to be, the personal things were supposed to be divided between my sister Carrie and my sister Ida and myself. Well, I was away at school, and then when I came back, I was living there with Mother, Ida, and Doctor. And so I had no place for anything special. So Mother gave me some of Aunt Lucy's silverware and some of her linen and things of that kind. Well, Christmas, of course, was always special in our family. We always enjoyed Christmas. As children, we always alternated between my Uncle John's home and our home. And but this Christmas of 1925, Mother had gotten things from Aunt Lucy's, and among them that she had given me were some old linen. We were talking about Christmas. Christmas was always a special time at home. I think I told you earlier that we alternated spending Christmas with Uncle John and Aunt Effie and the family, and at our house. We had a Christmas tree at whichever home we happened to be celebrating that particular year. When I was about 5, I remember that Itha insisted that I have a Christmas tree of my own. We always also hung up our stockings on the secretary that we had in the living room. The drawers had knobs on, and we would hang our stockings on those. That is, we did up to a certain point. After we were old enough to realize that perhaps the stockings were being filled by somebody else than Santa Claus, we discontinued that practice. I remember the last year that I hung mine up, my brothers and sisters put my old dirty rubbers in my stocking as a joke. They thought I was old enough to discontinue the practice of hanging up my stocking on Christmas night and Christmas morning. But by 1925, we had all grown up, and I don't recall that we had many practical jokes during those early years. About the only traditional thing that I remember was my grandmother making cake donuts, and she always sugared them, and she would hang one on the Christmas tree for each one of the grandchildren. We could have one off the Christmas tree after all the gifts had been distributed, but up until that time, they remained on the tree, and I would be so hungry looking at it and wishing that I could have a bite out of it. Beginning about 1925, the practical jokes began to appear on our Christmas tree. And I would say for the next few minutes, you people who hate practical jokes may be excused from the picture because you're going to be hearing about some of the crazy things that the Wilcox family has done. Aunt Lucy's 3 old linen towels that were so badly worn and that I inherited from her proved to be one of the oldest practical jokes that we have in the family. In 1925, when she passed away, her mother, among other things, and some others that were much better than that, gave me these. As I recall, there were 3 towels. They were badly worn, and my sisters and I had quite a joke about it. So I thought, well, I'll just give one of those towels give one to each one of them for Christmas. But I forgot it. Well, a friend of mine had passed away, or her father had passed away. She lived in Glens Falls, New York, and she and her mother wanted me to come to spend Christmas with them. I didn't want to be away from home for Christmas, and so I told them that if they would wait and celebrate Christmas the day after, I would come that night, Christmas night, and be there with them the next day. So that was what I did. But when I went to pack my suitcase, I suddenly, at the end of Christmas Day, I suddenly remembered that I hadn't given these towels to Carrie and Itha. So I took them downstairs and unwrapped and just handed one to each one of them. And we had another good laugh about them. And I went back upstairs to finish packing, and I went to the bathroom. And while I was in the bathroom, I thought, now it would be just like them to try to put those towels in my suitcase. So when I went back to my bedroom, I opened my suitcase and lifted up my clothes that I had packed in. Sure enough, there they were in the bottom of the suitcase. So I took them out, and I kept that suitcase in sight so that they wouldn't have a chance to get them back in. Well, in those days, in order to go to Glens Falls, I had to go into Buffalo by train and change and take Pullman through to Albany, and then another train north to Glens Falls the next morning. I got into Buffalo, got into the Pullman, and when I went to undress to go to bed and I opened my suitcase, here were these 2 towels right on top. And I couldn't imagine when in the world they had had a chance to put them in there. For just a minute, I had left the hall where the suitcase had been set down and had gone into the dining room, and it didn't seem as though there was time enough that they could have put them in there, but that was the time that they did. So I took them on to Glens Falls, of course, and immediately put them in a box and wrapped them up and mailed them to Carrie, so that she would have them. Well, from that day on, the old towels were a part of Christmas and practically every holiday. I believe that year I got that back for my birthday, the 3 towels. Finally, one towel became lost, and then another towel became lost as we passed them around for birthdays and holidays and anniversaries, wedding gifts, and so forth. Finally, now that was in 1925. Finally, about 1939, I would say, the 2 towels had diminished to the size of a washcloth. As somebody would unwrap the gift at Christmas time and find it, they'd give it a throw to somebody else, and they would throw it to somebody else, and they would get torn, and so, as I say, it was diminished to the size of a small washcloth. Well, it didn't appear on the Christmas tree for that Christmas. But Carrie and Iva had given me a very lovely pink rayon bed jacket. Carrie had made it. And I had it for 3 or 4 days when I put it on, and as I happened to throw it back one day and looked down here, there was a pocket appliqued onto my bed jacket, and it was the old towel, what was left of it, the remnant that was left of it. Well, so I took this remnant and I put it on a piece of linen, appliqued on in the shape of the body of a bird. Then I outlined a tail and a head and some legs, feet, framed it, and gave it to somebody, I don't know who, for Christmas. So that, through the years, is still being passed around. Sometimes it'll disappear for a year or 2. Somebody forgets they have it. Then they find it and put it on the Christmas tree or send it in a package. But it always appears. Well, a few years ago, it disappeared for 3 or 4 years. Finally, one spring morning, I went to my mailbox, and here was a package. Oh, since I've been living in Irving. I opened it up, and here was the old towel. Well, the postmark on it was in Maryland. Well, there's none of the family living in Maryland. So I thought, now, who has sent me that old towel? Who had that old towel? Well, just before this, some friends from Pennsylvania had visited Jim and Lee here in Irving. And I thought, well, I'll bet they tied up that old towel and put it in a package and gave it to them. And on their way home, they were going through Maryland. and had them mail it to me. So I telephoned to Jim and I said, "You will never guess what I received in the mail this morning." And he said, "It wasn't the old towel, was it?" And I said, "Oh, so you're the one that sent it." And he said, "What do you mean? I don't know where the old towel is." And he finally convinced me that he had had nothing to do with it. But you could just see how we all remembered the old towel when it hadn't appeared for 3 or 4 years. And it was the first thing he thought of when I asked him what he thought I received in the mail that morning. Well, I kept on. Finally, I figured that my niece Ella, who lived in New Jersey, had a daughter, Donna, and she travels considerably in her work. And I thought, I'll bet that she had Donna mail that from somewhere in Maryland, so I wouldn't guess where it came from. And I thought, if I just keep quiet, somebody after a while will say something and I'll find out. So it went along, maybe a month. And finally, Ella, in one of her letters at the end, said, "P.S. Whatever happened to the old towel?" So then I knew that she was the one. But as I say, the old towel is still passing around. There was another thing that we had. You know, in the good old days that we talk about, before the days of bathrooms, when if you had to go to the toilet in the night, you had to go out you would have to go out back of the house. Everybody under their bed always had a pot, which was very politely called a chamber in those days. Well, they usually were made of porcelain or china, and so when you took the cover off or put it on, it made a great deal of noise. So they crocheted what they call a silencer and put onto the cover, and it came down over it like a tam-o-shanter, and came down over the top of the edge of the cover, so that when you would move it, why, it wouldn't make any noise. That was the reason it was called a silencer. Well, years after, many years after we had left the farm, Mother still had one of the old pots and it had a silencer on it. I believe that it was in the winter of 1936 that she and I were both quite ill at the same time. And we had a nurse for her. And Carrie came to take care of me. Well, we had one bedpan. So the bedpan was supposed to be left in the bathroom at night, so whichever nurse wanted it, for whichever patient, why, they could get it without disturbing the other people. Well, one night they forgot it, and the nurse forgot to leave it in there, and so I said to Carrie, "Oh, I think I can slide over the edge of the bed, and you get the old chamber in there, and let's use that." Well, when she went to get it, she dropped the cover and broke it, which left the old silencer without a cover to cover. So one day later on, I was better, but Mother was still very ill. Carrie and Itha happened to run onto this old silencer, so they wrapped it up in a box and wrapped it with gift wrap and took it in and gave it to Mother. Well, she opened it up, and when she saw what it was, she just had a good laugh. Well, it was dirty. It had collected dust, I think, all of these years and hadn't been washed. And but anyway, it got put to one side, and several weeks later, after Carrie had gone back home, Bert was going out there one day, and Mother called me, and she said, I want you to get that old silencer and get a box for it, and we'll gift wrap it and send it to Carrie. So Isa helped me, and we gift wrapped it. We put ribbon on it and some pussy willows. It was the spring of the year. And, it was looked like a lovely Easter gift. So Bert took it to her. So when Bert handed it to her, he said that she said, oh, that mother of mine, she said, every time I go out there to do anything for her, she thinks she has to give me something. And of course Bert knew what was in the package. Well, when she saw it, she had a good laugh too. So I had said when we sent it out, now I'll get that back for Easter. Sure enough, when it came back, she had laundered it, and she had made a pom-pom and put it in the top of it, so that it looked just like a tam o' shanter. Well, from then on, it passed from one person to another. Some decorated it with flowers. Some would put different kinds of ribbon on it. And that showed up at for birthdays and anniversaries, and Christmas and Easter. Any time it was likely to appear when you least expected it. When Jim went into service, and when it was overseas, when I was packing his package for Christmas, I thought, I wish I had something I could send him that just that he'll know it's from home. And suddenly I happened to think of the old silencer. So I took it and wrapped it and sent it to him. Well, he told me that the minute he saw that piece of crochet down in the bottom of the box, he knew in a minute what it was. So he put it in the toolbox in the tank that he was driving at that time. And when he was injured and had to go back to the base hospital, during that time, they took that tank and gave a new one to his unit. And when the tank went, the old silencer went with it in the toolbox. So we never know where the old silencer may be, but at least it ended up so far as the Wilcox family was concerned. My mother, as you know, lived to be 101, and I think the last Christmas that she lived was the only Christmas that I can remember that she didn't hand to me something, some practical joke that she wanted me to wrap and give to somebody to put it on the Christmas tree. But that year she didn't. But there were always funny things that we had to enjoy, and we always had such a lot of fun with them.
And let me interrupt you right now. We decided to not go out there and do that because it's too windy and it will make too much noise if we do it inside, so we're just going to listen to the story if we can. You can tell us now.
All right, well, that's just fine. I hope that you will be interested in the story, and that Lindsay will be. I think I really shouldn't tell this because it just sounds so awful, and it was awful.
I'll go ahead.
But it was so funny. It was so funny. We got such a good laugh about it that they still kid me about it. One Christmas, they wanted to know what I wanted for Christmas, and I told them that I wanted that seemed to be the only thing that I could think of that particularly that I wanted. So when Christmas came, off the tree came this long package that looked exactly like an umbrella. And when I opened it, well, before I got it all open, I realized what they had done. My brother Charlie had butchered, and they had wrapped the cow's tail
Oh, no.
up like an umbrella.
Ooh, Aunt Helen. Oh.
And that's the reason I said I thought I shouldn't tell it. I think that was the worst thing that anybody ever did.
What did you think about that? Did you laugh?
Why, of course I did. Of course I did.
I would have gone, ooh, how awful.
Oh, they have kidded me about that a good many times since then about it. Well, of course, I continued to practice there in Olean, and finally, in 1929, of course, the stock market crashed, and we began to enter into the Depression years. People will say, well, a depression wouldn't affect a doctor. People still get sick. And that is true. But when a depression comes, people will refrain from going to a doctor for minor things for which they would have attention if they had more means. Mm-hmm. Or if they are ill and have to go to the doctor, if they're out of work and so forth, it's impossible for them to pay for it. Therefore, it affects a physician's practice, not only in the quantity of work that he does, but also in his income. Gradually, at that time, I was practicing with Uncle John and my brother-in-law, and we had a fine practice there in Olean. Finally, by 1932, it had reached the point that there was enough for one, but there really was not enough for the two of us to, and I just felt that if anyone made the move, that I should, because I was the last one there. So I suggested that I go to Salamanca, which was about 18 miles east of, or west of Olean. I rented a two-room office, because I think back now, I paid $15 a month for it.
God.
I went down 2 days a week just to see how it would work out. And gradually, I built up a little practice there. So by fall, I decided to make the change and go there permanently. So I left Olean and went down, and for that first winter, I rented a room, and then I had fixed one little corner in my office where I could do some cooking. I had a cabinet that you'd never dreamed that was what it was for, and prepared most of my meals there. Now, by 1932, we were in the depth of the Depression. The Depression didn't strike Salamanca quite as early as it did some other places. An optometrist who was there told me that they kept hearing about the Depression all around them. And but it didn't seem to be bothering there particularly until he said one morning he went to his office and all of a sudden people just stopped coming, dropped off to where he had just a few patients. And from that time on, it was true. Salamanca fortunately had several small business concerns, and some of them were able to continue working a part of the time. And so it did help, but the depression that we are having in 1982 and 83 is nothing compared to that time. They had no unemployment insurance in those days. There was no such thing as Medicare or Medicaid. Very few people carried hospital insurance. And it just kept getting worse and worse. I have my old bank book that I had when I opened my account in Salamanca. And I think I opened my account with $35. And I don't know how long it was before I ever made a deposit of over $100. It would be $15, $20. And even though I was paying only $15 rent for my 2 rooms at the office, I recall going home one night and going past the newsroom. There was a new Good Housekeeping in the window, and I believe it was a quarter. And I started to go in to get it. And I thought, no, I can't have that. I've got to pay my rent next week. And then the thought went through my mind, well, I wonder if the day will ever come that I can spend a quarter without wondering if I should, or if that's the best thing right now. But of course, another thing you have to remember, things were very, very cheap at that time. I could go to the grocery store probably and for $1 buy what I pay $8 or $10 for now. But that $1 was just as hard to get.
Yeah.
And there were so many pathetic things. I recall one Sunday a man calling me that he said, I'm a stranger to you. And he said, I am so sick. I've just got to have some help. He said, I have been out of work for 6 months, and I don't have any money. But he said, I have an opportunity to go back to my old job on the railroad tomorrow morning. But he said, I am so sick that I'll just never be able to do it unless I have some help. And I said, well, can you come to the office? And he said, yes. And so I said, well, I would meet him over there. So I went over and opened up the office, and I can still see him as he came in. He was rather a small man. He had on an old khaki overcoat that he had in the First World War, which of course was badly worn by this time. And of course that color, that shade never gave anybody any color anyway. And he was so sick. Oh, he was so sick. And when I examined him, I found that he had quinsy. Now, quinsy is an abscess that forms behind the tonsil, and people used to have it quite frequently, and it was they would always be so sick with it, and such a very, very sore throat. And I said, I just can't possibly fix you so that you can go to work tomorrow morning. It will be impossible. I said, it will be at least a week before you will be able to go. And of course, remember, in those days we had no cell phone, we had no antibiotics. And but I treated him, sent him home to bed, and then I went to the house 2 or 3 times that week. And finally, a week from the next Monday morning, they held his job for him. and he went back to work. And he said, now, as soon as I get some money, I'll pay you. And, you know, the first check that he received, I think he went around town and paid everybody $1 that he owed them. Now, at that time, I was getting $2 for an office call, $3 for a house call. Eventually, he did pay it all, but he was so honest about it, and he and his family were patients of mine for years and years, and I have no idea how many people he referred to me over the years, and but I can still see him as he looked that Sunday afternoon as he came in my office door. He was so sick. But sometimes people could pay me $1, and oftentimes they couldn't pay me anything. Right across the street from me was a drugstore, woman's drugstore. Next to it was a wallpaper store. I don't remember whether he carried paints or not. Probably did. But during the summer months, Mr. Miller, the wallpaper man, and Mr. Holman, the druggist, they'd bring their chairs out on the sidewalk out in front of the store and sit out there and visit. I could see them from my office. They'd sit out there and visit. Once in a while, Mr. Holman would have somebody come into the drugstore. But Mr. Miller, almost never anyone came in for wallpaper. No one could afford wallpaper. And that was one of the luxuries that you got along without in those days. And he finally had to close his store. But Mr. Holman managed to hang on, and he was there for quite a many years. After that, there's something else about the depression. Another thing I recall about going to a picnic one day, and as we were seated at the table eating, I looked at the people on the opposite side, up and down, and it was amazing the number of people who needed dental care. A chipped tooth here, or one that was broken off, one that had been pulled but no replacement. People getting along with dentures. And I remember being told about an MD in Rochester who took a job running an elevator between at certain hours in order just to keep his family. And so the depression just hit everybody in some way. As I say, in 1932, I moved down there to Salamanca, and in 1933, of course, Roosevelt was elected, or was elected in 32 and became president in 33. And on this certain morning after that, I went to the bank at 9 o'clock and made a deposit. I don't know how much. I know it wasn't very much, but it was all I had that I could deposit. And at 10 o'clock, we got word that the banks had all been closed. Every bank had been closed. And you couldn't get in to get money or to deposit money or anything. And by this time, I had built up a fairly, as good a practice as you could expect to have at a time like that. And almost immediately when that news came over the radio, not TV, we didn't have that then, but over the radio, my telephone began to ring. And patients, unless they had something that was really acute, they canceled their appointment because they didn't want to spend any money that they didn't absolutely have to, because we didn't know when the banks would open.
Yeah.
There were two banks there in Salamanca, and I can't recall. I don't think they were closed, but 2 or 3 days. But one of them never did reopen. And there were people in that town that had all of their life savings in that bank. There was no federal insurance in those days like we have now in the banks. And as a result, they had a very difficult time. And it was, but when the bank was finally liquidated, and of course they did get something back, but not anywhere near what they would have had it gone on. And the bank finally did reopen only as another, I don't know, it was not under the same ownership, I'm sure. We were still in the Depression when, in February of 1934, one morning I went to my office and was taking care of my first patient when I had a very severe chill. I had felt perfectly all right when I first got up. I had this awful chill, and I began to get sick. And as the morning went on, I got sicker and sicker. And so I called a friend of mine and asked her if she could take me to Olean, because my sister Ita and her husband, who was the osteopathic physician, and mother still lived in Olean. And she said she could at 1 o'clock. So she took me up, and by the time we left Salamanca, I could just barely sit up in the car. I felt I could never wait to get to Olean and go to bed. And I had lobar pneumonia, which in those days was, well, it's still serious, but you don't hear of many cases of it. And Carrie came, my sister Carrie, who was a nurse, came from Canasteo. She and Ed had moved there. And she came to take care of me. Now today, they would have put me in the hospital in no time. But in those days, people didn't go to the hospital. If they could get a trained nurse to take care of them, or if they could be taken care of at home. And of course, here was my brother-in-law, who was a doctor, and both of my brother-in-law, but Ed, of course, was in Canasteo, and so he saw me about once a week. But my other brother-in-law was there all the time. In fact, he used to get up at night to treat me. And, well, I got sicker and sicker, and I was so terribly ill. And they called in consultation, and they were suspicious that there was further trouble in the lung than just the pneumonia, but they couldn't locate it. But finally did. I had empyema, which means an abscess that forms in the chest cavity. And here again, as I was thinking about this morning, I would think today with the x-ray, they would have x-rayed me and would have found this. But I can't recall in those days that there was even any thought of taking me over to the hospital and x-raying me. And the hospital was right across the street. And in fact, the surgeon over there was one of the men that had been called in consultation. So it was pretty near a month before they found this. So the surgeon came over, and Ed came up and they made the opening in my side and drained this cavity. So, but I had been getting weaker and weaker. In fact, very few people lived in those days who developed empyema. But Carrie gave me such good care. And after they had that drainage and then would irrigate it day by day. And I believe it was 6 weeks from the day that I went to bed that I was able to sit up 3 minutes.
Wow.
I had lost so much strength I couldn't even turn myself in bed. And I couldn't feed myself. The silverware was too heavy.
Well, I've been there when I
If
was
anybody has been
pregnant.
really sick, they know how that can be. Anyway, but I recovered from that and was able by the next fall to resume practice part-time, not full-time by any means. I would have to scatter my appointments through the day so that I would have rest periods in between. But by fall, Dr. and Itha decided to move back to Salamanca, where he had lived before they were married and where he had practiced. And so I lived with them from then on. And in another year or two, I moved my practice from out of the Dietrich block over onto South Main Street to 19 South Main and practiced there. Meanwhile, after Dr. and Itha moved to Salamanca, he had an office in his home. They were at 48 Broad Street, and it was such a very big house that there was plenty of room for him to have the office as well as the family all living there. And 2 years later, after their moving, Mother fell and fractured her hip. In those days, we didn't think that anybody, I think she was 81, 80, right around there. We didn't think that it was wise to operate on anybody that old. And so we kept her at home and used sandbags and kept her in bed. And meanwhile, Doctor purchased the house next door to where we were living and remodeled 58 Broad Street, and we moved over there. So that was, as I had, as I said, moved my office over onto South Main Street. I suppose the years the year of 1941, the years of 1941 and 42 were probably the hardest years, I would say, of my life, in that winter of 41 and 42. Dr. Henderson's health had been failing, and by June of 41, we had to have a practical nurse at the house to take care of him. He was in bed most of the time, and the summer months went past, and then Itha had always had very severe hay fever. And that year she had it especially hard, and following her hay fever, she seemed to have a bad sinus infection and complained a lot of headaches. we were so concerned, I think about Doctor, that as I think back, there were things that I didn't observe about her that I would have otherwise, but we were so concerned about him and his condition. And also, by the 1st of September, we had realized that he was never going to be able to practice. I was trying to take care of what little practice he had left, as well as my own, and I had my office over on Main Street. Their funds were practically gone with the depression and his illness, and so I was having to help maintain the household. So Ith and I talked it over and decided that I would close my office on South Main Street and move over into his offices. But I didn't want him to feel that I was pushing him out, even though I knew that he would never be able to use it. So I remodeled it in such a way that he still had a room. And he came downstairs one day while they were remodeling it, but he was never down again. Never saw it after that. Was never able to practice. And he just kept getting worse during the fall, and Ida complained more and more of her headaches, and I was busy getting my practicing. Not that it was a heavy one by any means, for we weren't over the depression yet. And finally, I got moved, closing my own office, moving over there. And one day, Mother was getting well along in her 80s by this time. And she had helped with the dishes, and she had helped with the cooking. Now, before this, Ida had done all of this, but she just gradually did less and less, and we just didn't seem to be getting anywhere with those headaches. And suddenly one night, I noticed something that quite alarmed me, and I called the ophthalmologist in Olean for an appointment, and took her up there the next morning. And this now was getting along into November. And but when he examined her, from the replies that she made, I could see that there was something very definitely wrong, that some of her vision was not good. And after he had finished examining her, he was very much afraid that she had a brain tumor, and that was causing her headaches rather than the sinus infection that we had thought it was. So he immediately made an appointment in Buffalo for me to take her into a specialist, and I took her in, and they felt that that was definitely it, and that she should be hospitalized shortly. Well, now, the neurosurgeon that we particularly wanted to see was having to leave town that night and would be gone for about a week. But he was lovely to me, and said that if I wanted to take her home for the week, I could do that, but he made it possible for me to keep in touch with his assistant if any emergency should arise. Well, then it was a question of making a decision whether she would, if she had a brain tumor, the tests were going to be very painful for her. And it would be a question of whether surgery following it would really be of any benefit. Meanwhile, during this time, as I said, Mother was able to help with some things, but one day she collapsed on the stairs. It was her heart. So we had my brother-in-law in one bedroom, and I had Mother in her room. And the nurse helped take care of her as well as here was Itha with his brain tumor. I went to Dr. Fleming, who was a younger man who had come to Salamanca. He had had quite a lot of experience in his internship with similar cases. So after being in Buffalo and talking with a neurosurgeon there, I went up to see him one evening, and Dr. Fleming, and talked with him. I told him about my sister and how she was, and he said that he finally said to me, well, now you have to take into consideration what the rest of the family wants you to do, what you think she would want you to do, and what you feel that you should do. But he said, I'm going to be frank with you. If it were myself, I would rather you would keep me right at home and make me as comfortable as you could, because he said her tumor is evidently in a location that it will do no good, and even if she lives through it, it will recur, and you will have put her to a lot of unnecessary pain. Mother didn't want to have her for me to take her in. I knew that she wouldn't want to. Meanwhile, we hadn't told her exactly what had happened, but she was beginning to show mental signs by this time. Then I talked with Carrie and Ed about it, and it was the only time through the years that professionally Ed and I disagreed on anything, and he felt that I should take her in and put her through the tests and have a surgery if they felt that it was best. Well, I finally decided against it. By December, the 1st of December, she went into a coma, and the first doctor was very bad by this time also. But she would rouse up, and she might have a day or 2 days that she would be perfectly normal, seemingly normal. But she was in bed. She had become paralyzed on one side. And then she might go into a coma for several hours or maybe for a day or two. Doctor passed away in December. And that was the only Christmas that I recall. That we didn't have Christmas.
Yeah.
He passed away at that time, and Itha was so bad. And Mother was now able to be up and out into the living room. Our living room was on the second floor, and her bedroom was just off from it, so she could get out there. I slept on the Davenport most of that winter because there was a patient in each bed. After Doctor passed away, we moved Itha in there, and I did have my room after that time, but up until that time, I did. But we still had to continue to have the nurse.
I'm mixed up now. Who was Itha married to, or was she
Dr.
married?
John.
She was married to the
Uncle
one
John.
that had
John
just died.
Henderson. Beg pardon?
The one that you just said just died? No, that was someone else
Dr. John's the one that died.
that just died.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, he was the osteopathic physician.
Oh, that you were? Okay.
And that I had taken over his office, and I lived with them. And then she lived until March, and she passed away in March of 1942. So that left Mother and me there. Mother's health gradually improved, but her heart was never good after that, and she was never able to be active. At the time, we just didn't expect that she would live very long. Therefore, Ruth, my niece, was still at home, but she married not too long after that. So it was a surprise to all of us that Mother lived so many years after that, and we're so pleased that she was, because it would have left me there entirely alone. Well, of course, in 41, the Japs dropped the bomb on Pearl Harbor, and we had the beginning of the Second World War. They, and I think that perhaps before we begin talking about that, just take a little break.
Okay, wait a minute, Aunt Helen. Wait a minute. I can just turn it off from here now. Okay.
They, of course, no one was expecting the Second World War. I remember going to church on Sunday morning, December 7th of 1941, and of hearing the minister announce that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And that was the first that I knew. And I don't think any of us could possibly comprehend the fact that we were at war with Japan, or that Japan had had the nerve to attack our country. We had such confidence in it that it was one of those periods in life, if we had known what was ahead of us, we would have felt as though we couldn't bear to really face it. During that winter, we began having blackouts. Of course, they were rehearsals, so that any enemy planes flying over could not spot localities. We had to either turn off all of our lights during one of these practice blackouts, or we had to pull down the shades and have shades that would fit our windows in such a way that no streak of light would show through. There were men who were appointed or volunteered to go out through the neighborhoods when the sirens would sound for the blackouts. And if they spotted a speck of light in any house, why, they would drum on the side of the house and tell you to extinguish your light or to fix that particular area so that it wouldn't show through. And we had that for those blackouts for several years during the war. One time, this would be hard for anyone to imagine who hasn't seen it. I went to New York to a convention, and in the evening in New York City, any store that had on lights in their windows had to have some type of, I don't know what it was, screening or netting or something of the kind that eliminated the glare, and the street lights were off. If you, there were no street sign, no theater signs. If you wanted to go to a theater, you had to know where it was. You couldn't look down the street and see the sign, and they called it a brownout rather than a blackout.
Now, why did they do
When
that?
we had a blackout, everything had to go off, either off or have your screens or shades that you could pull that would
Was that so people from the air couldn't see the? Why was
so
that?
that people from the air couldn't see you. And the brownout in New York was in case there were lookouts from the ocean trying to see into New York. And it was a very weird feeling to
How
be
long did
there
that last, Aunt Helen?
in New York City and go out on the streets, and everybody drove with their dimmers. I believe we had to drive with our dimmers, with our dimmers on. There was very little light on.
How long did you have to do that?
Oh, they had to do this all during the war. We had about 4 years, you see, that we were in the war.
I don't remember.
And how soon they started it, I don't know.
Was that just in New York City?
But that was in New York City, and I'm sure that all the cities along the coast were the same way.
Because see,
But that was every night.
I don't ever remember my parents telling me about that in San Antonio.
Uh-huh.
But I've
And,
been doing that. And see, in San Antonio, there's all those Air Force bases.
and they, and of course, doctors were called into service, and in Salamanca, where I was practicing, there had been several younger doctors who had come there to practice, and they were called to service, and as a result, they one doctor who had retired came back into practice in order to help out because there was such a shortage of them. I remember one instance that was impressed on my mind, an experience that I had during that time. I received word one day to come to Workmen's Compensation Court, and it gave the name of the patient that I was to testify for. I had no record of this patient. I couldn't think who he was, and I couldn't find any record. So I finally, I looked up his name in the telephone directory, and then when he told me about it, then I remembered. I think had happened some 2 or 3 years before that he had injured himself, and he had been going to one of the other doctors in the city. He wasn't improving as he felt he should, and so he came to my office one day to talk with me about coming to me. And I think I examined him, but anyway, I told him that whatever was the trouble, that I didn't feel that I could do any more for him than the other doctor was, and that I recommended that he just stay with this other doctor. Well, meanwhile, he was still having trouble all of this time, and his employer's insurance company didn't want to pay his bill, and so he was being taken into compensation court. Well, this other doctor under whose care he was at the time he came to me had passed away. He had been to 2 other doctors. They had both been called in service. And that left no one but me to testify for him. And yet I had no record of it. And I couldn't recall my findings. And it was a most unusual thing that I didn't have a record of it.
Yeah.
But I think because of the fact that I wasn't going to treat the case, that I just thought it wasn't important. Well, anyway, I went to compensation court, and I explained to the judge that I didn't feel qualified to testify in the case, and I explained why. And well, she asked me to remain while she was taking the testimony of the patient and 1 or 2 witnesses and so forth. And so then finally she turned to me and she said, well, Dr. Wilcox, now that you have heard the history of the case and the findings of some of the x-ray reports and so forth, she said, would you be willing to testify in this case? Because this man has no one to represent him. It's just impossible because these other doctors, you see, had gone to war. And so I did. The lawyer for the insurance company was very much put out about it, and that she permitted it. And she said, well, she said, Dr. Wilcox is licensed in the state of New York, and she had asked me, she said, how many cases like this have you ever treated? I said, well, I have no idea. I said, a great many of them.
Yeah.
And she said, I consider her qualified to express her opinion in this case. So
So it was a,
there were many.
so it was a female judge.
Yes, it happened to be a female judge that day.
That's why the guy was so hacked off.
Maybe.
The female judge, the female doctor.
But anyway, those things happened during the war, and
Well, did the guy
I
win his
worked-
case?
beg pardon?
Did the guy win his case?
Was what?
Did the guy win his case? Did your guy that you were testifying?
Oh yeah, yes, he got his
He
compensation.
got his compensation.
But he deserved it too. We were, because of the fact that there were so few doctors in town that we were all just worked to death almost. I would be in my office sometimes from 9 in the morning until 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, and then 3 nights a week I would go back in from 7 o'clock until I was through. I worked by appointment during the day, but in the evening, for the sake of the people who were working and couldn't make appointments, I just took them as they came. And sometimes I would go into the office after putting in a full day's work, and here would be people standing. We didn't have room for them to be seated, and I knew that I'd be working until 10, 11 o'clock that night.
How did you do that?
I don't know how I did it, but I did. But it was, those were rough years. I remember one night of, I was so tired, and as I went from one treatment room to the other, I thought, oh, will there ever be an end to this thing? And I went in, and here sat this great, big railroad engineer. And I thought, oh, no. And I said to him, well, how are you tonight? And he said, well, I guess I'm as good as I can be. He said, I haven't had a day off. And he told how long it had been. And I thought, well, I've done better than that. But those railroad men, I just admired those men. They just went through so much during that Second World War. Especially that last winter of 1944-45, we had excessive snow that year. Up on Miller Hill in Nepoli, where the old farm is, they had to restring the telephone wires because the snow got so deep that when they shoveled it off of the road and piled it up beside the road, it touched the telephone wires, and they had to restring them. Many a place that you couldn't see the houses from the highway, except when you would get into the driveway to go into their place. It was just unbelievable. And those railroad men, in all of that snow, and it was a cold winter as well, they kept those trains running, and in some cases their trains would get snowbound somewhere, and they'd get off and shovel the track, and it was just a hard time for them, and I just admired them so much. We were a railroad center there, and many times when a convoy, you see, they in those days they didn't fly materials and fly them in over to Europe. They went by boat.
Wow.
They still didn't have the planes for doing it that they have now. And so when ships went, there would be a group of them, a convoy, go together. And there would be the battleships to go along with them for protection. So sometimes when they were waiting for a convoy to be loaded, before they were ready for materials, you see, there would be a lot of materials converging on Jersey City and New York City at one time for these convoys. And if they sent everything down there the same day, it would be terrible.
Yeah.
So they would hold up materials, boxcars, way back. And sometimes there in our yards, there would be boxcars of materials that would be there for a day or two, and then all of a sudden there would come the order through to send them down to New York. Now, these railroad men were not supposed to tell anybody that those were being sent down, because they knew that when they went down, shortly there was a convoy going out, and if the enemy found out that the convoy was going out, of course that gave them a clue as to when to attack it. And I can't remember of a railroad man ever telling me, even confidentially, that there were any of those cars going out until after they had gone. Now, maybe a few days afterwards, they say, well, there must be a convoy on the way because of such and such. One of the interesting experiences that a man told me about, he said that one night a refrigerator, an express train, that I think he said 3 refrigerator cars, they were just a short train, pulled in, and they had received word that it was to be given the right of way. And it pulled in, and the minute it pulled in, there were guards that jumped off from each car, and armed guards. And he said to the conductor of the train, he said, what you got on here? He said, I don't know. He said, the invoice is inside of this little box, and it's locked. He said, I'm taking it to such and such a place, but he had no idea what was on there.
You know, that's it.
And so they never knew.
They never knew how dangerous some of their missions were, I bet.
What was that?
I imagine that some of those guys were on some pretty dangerous missions and didn't even know it.
Yes, they may have been, and yet they may have been emergency supplies of some kind, even hospital supplies, or but something that they didn't want them to know anyway what it was. So of course we never knew. But I wasn't told that until after it had all happened, sometime after it had all happened. So the war, and of course the war years were, there was your worry about your various loved ones. Jim had gone to war and been called in. Howard went, but of course he was discharged in a very short time because of physical disability. But the different ones in the family that went, and friends that you knew, and it went on, and it's just hard to describe to anyone who didn't live in those days as to just all of the how you did feel about some of the things, and how weary you became of, and wish so much that it would be over. And I remember so well the day that we got word that the war had ended. In the First World War, as I told you, the whistles blew and the church bells rang, and everybody got out, and it was all blue. After the Second World War, the church bells rang and the whistle blew and so forth, but there was not so much of the hoopla, but people just poured into the churches. The churches that perhaps ordinarily were not open during the day were immediately unlocked, and people went in to pray. And that night there were just spontaneous services held all over the nation almost. People were so grateful to think that it was over.
I wonder why it was different.
I don't know. Well, it had lasted so much longer. Oh, so much longer. You see,
World War I only lasted
so far as our involvement in the First World War, you see, we were only in it, less than 2 years. And this one, you see, went on for over 4 years. And for about 4 years. And so that...
Well, and also there had been a lot more devastating things that had happened.
Oh, yes.
With the bombing of Pearl Harbor and all the men
so
that had
many
been
more
killed
people.
there. And
Yes.
then we had to do the bomb thing.
Yes.
And that had to be real... I imagine that there were a lot of people that were real happy but that had to be a real disquieting thing to happen, to have
Oh,
our country bomb a
we had-
city.
I can't remember ever hearing about an atomic bomb up until that time, until it was detonated. Now, I may have, but the first thing that I ever remember, I must have known about it, something about it. But my first recollection of the atomic bomb, I was sitting by my radio. And now, I may be wrong, this may have been a newscaster, but it seems to me that it was President Truman making the announcement that this bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. And I can just remember burying my face in my hands, and just said, "Dear Lord, forgive us." It just seemed as though it was something that just couldn't have happened. But I know it shortened the war.
Yeah, but it,
And I know it saved the lives of a lot of Americans, but it took a lot of other lives too. And it's one of those things that there are quite a lot of things in this world that can they have so much good in them, and yet they can be used for such awful purposes. There have so many good things come out of the research, the atomic research. Just lots of good things that have come out of them. And yet, the awful atomic bomb that we just, we've got it now, and we don't know what to do with it. We can't discard it anywhere. Nobody wants to get the waste that comes from it. It pollutes our food, and yet it's something that we have to deal with. And so that, of course, was near the end of the Second World War. I continued to live there in Salamanca and practice. I had given up, not too long after that, I gave up making house calls because it had reached the point that it was very difficult for me to, it was tiring. Also, Mother had sometimes very sudden and acute attacks of asthma at night where she required attention, and I didn't like to go out at night and leave her there alone. So I gave up house calls because I didn't like to say, well, yes, I'll come in the daytime, but I won't come at night. So from that time on, I did very, very little of that, except in very great emergencies. In 1953, Charlie's wife, Velma, passed away, and we had, from Father's death in 1911, we had so few breaks in our family until Ida passed away in 42. And I mean in our own immediate family of my brothers and sisters. And then, as I say, we went on there until 1953 when Velma passed away. Then in 1954, Mother celebrated her 100th birthday. And that was a great celebration. It had been a very busy summer for me, and Carrie had said to me, she said, I think we ought to have a little bit of a celebration for Mother's birthday. And as I was leaving on a vacation, the very last of August, I said to her, well, anything you want to plan will be all right with me. But I said, I'm just too tired now to even think about it. So I didn't get back until in September, and of course Mother's birthday was the 17th. Well, it was really rather funny. Of course, Mother mentally it was wonderful. And one of the newspaper men from Olean called and said that he'd like to get a write-up about her to put in the Olean paper. And he wondered when he could see me for an interview. And I said, well, the only time I can give you right now is tomorrow noon or whenever it was. And I said, but you could see Mother most any time. And, well, it was very evident that he didn't think that he cared about interviewing Mother. And he was quite insistent that he see me. So he came whenever I told him. And so when I finished, I said, wouldn't you like to meet my mother? Well, he didn't want to be impolite, you know. So I took him upstairs, and he met Mother. And I said, now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to the office. And I think it was some 2 hours later that he came downstairs, and I went out and I said, well, did you get along all right? He said, I was never so amazed in my life. He was particularly interested in the history of Cattaraugus County, and of course my mother had lived there all her life. Yeah. And he just had a wonderful visit with her. And he had such a nice write-up in the paper about her and about her life. And so when I returned home from my vacation, my sister said, well, I had thought we'd just have a little open house. And she said, we weren't going to send out any invitations, but just let some of our friends know that it was her birthday, and we'd have open house. And she said, well, some people from this place wanted to come, and some people from that place. She said, I don't know how many we're going to have here. And I said, well, let them come. So we were going to have open house for her. I think it was from 2 to 4 and 7 to 9 on her birthday. Norman and Ann came from Chicago, and they, of course, all of the family around there were excited about it. So we had Mother upstairs, our living room was upstairs on the 2nd floor, and we had Mother up in the living room, and we let people come up and visit with her for just a minute and then go back downstairs where we had the refreshments. Well, by the time we closed the door that night, there had been 154. And she of course was tired, and she had telephone calls, and she had telegrams, and our house looked like a garden. I had ordered a corsage for her, and when I called, for some reason, I called the florist that morning for something, and she said, well, she said, somebody has ordered some cut flowers. She said, would you like me to arrange them in a vase for you? And I said, well, that would be nice if you would do that. So when she came down, she came in with the corsage and these cut flowers, and she said, well, I'll go back out the truck. Should I have a few more things out here? I said, oh, you have? She said, yes. And in her book, her guest book, we listed all of her gifts and so forth. And I believe there were 26 floral gifts, every ranging from her African violets up to several big baskets of flowers, you know. And as I say, the house looked like a veritable garden with all of these beautiful flowers. And she had cablegrams and telegrams, and, as I say, the telephone calls. Well, we had decided that to try to have all of the family for that day also was going to be just too much. So we waited until the next day then and had just the family for dinner the following night. There, just the relatives. There were, and I don't know, I've forgotten how many there were of us, but we had a lot of them there, and so she just so thoroughly enjoyed that.
Boy, I bet she did.
And
I bet she did.
and she Although all of those, well, up until the very last couple of years, she usually was able to maybe go out for a ride or go for a ride or sometimes she would be able to go down to my niece Ella's or but about the last couple of years she wasn't able to get out at all, and in fact was not up and downstairs. We ate most of our meals upstairs in the living room, carried them up there from the kitchen so that we could eat together.
Well, did she get out of bed?
Oh yes. There was very little time that, now she might be ill and be in bed for several days with an illness of some kind, but then she would be up and we could get her out into the living room, which was just off her bedroom. And so she, even in her last illness, she was only in bed, I think she was up on Friday morning and she died on Sunday afternoon. And but her mentality kept perfectly clear. One of the funny things that happened in connection with her birthday, the next morning after her birthday, one of the doctors in town came to the door and he said, I couldn't get in to see your mother yesterday, and he said, I'd love to meet her. He never had met her. Now, he happened to be the coroner, and she knew it. Well, I went upstairs and to see that she was all right and ready to see him, and then I called for him to come on up. And so when he came in, he said something about he was so pleased to meet her, and she said, well, I'm pleased to meet you, but she said, I'm really not quite ready for you. He was the coroner. She was a very cheerful nature. People used to say they went there thinking they'd go in to cheer her up a little bit, and they came away being cheered up. Rather than
you must take after her, Aunt Helen.
Oh, thank you. She had a keen sense of humor. As I told you before, she always had a joke to put on the Christmas tree for people. I remember one time her sending word to my brother, your Grandpa Charlie. He hadn't been down for quite a few days. I don't know, it might have been 2 or 3 weeks. And it seems that when he was a little boy, sometimes when he didn't do things, she'd, especially if they were outdoors, she'd reach down and pick the little, well, I suppose it's the flower of the plantain weed, but it's quite a long stalk, and it's tough. She'd take that and she'd just switch his ankles with it, you know. And they used to joke about it after he was grown up. And so she sent word to him that if she had a piece of plantain, she'd send it to him. And so when he got the message, he said, I guess that I better get down to see my mother. I think that's what she needed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But she was a sweet person.
We're kind of backtracking here, but did she, if she was 100 years old in 1954, then she was born in 1854,
right,
which was before the Civil War.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So, and she was not really a baby when the Civil War was going on. She was like 10 years old.
She would have been, she would have been...
it was over in 1864.
60 to 64. And you see, she...
could she tell you very much about him?
No, not about the Civil War. She remembered a few things, but not
she was
much.
really too little.
Yeah, she was really too little. So
people weren't as informed back then. And
that's right. And you didn't know so many things that were going on. You didn't know it for days and weeks afterwards, you know.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine now, but nevertheless, that was it. And they... So she lived until 1956, and she passed away in April of which of course then left me alone there as far as the family was concerned. And I continued practicing there. Then in 1958, my brother Charlie and Jack and I, Jack was 13 then, took a trip west during the summer months, and we visited my brother Walter, who was then in Hood River. His wife Edith had passed away, and so while we were there, we planned that my brother Walter would come back east in the fall of 1959, and he and Charlie and I would take a trip through New England.
Mm-hmm.
For Charlie and I had never been up there, and Walter had only been there once. So those were our plans. Well, meanwhile, I guess I had failed to mention here that in that spring of 1956, or in February of 1956, my brother Bert had passed away very suddenly. We had always hoped that Mother would not have to lose any more of her family while she lived, but he died very suddenly. And let's see, he was 78, 79. And it was quite unusual for a person that age to pass away and have one of their parents still living.
Yeah.
But anyway, we had made these plans. Well, that we would take this trip. Well, we went back home, and Charlie remarried and married Helen Mackenzie. And so when it came time to go in 1959 on the trip through New England, why, Helen was teaching, and so that did away with Charlie's going on the trip. Well, meanwhile, in the spring of February of 1959, I went to the hairdresser's one morning, and as I stepped into her beauty shop, I stepped onto a rug, and her floor was very, very slippery.
Uh-huh.
And I slipped and fell and fractured my
That's
hip.
when you hurt your head.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Aunt Helen, right here. I'm going to go give this little girl some lunch. I'll be right back, okay? I'm going to fix her some lunch. You just keep right on.
Right. So, of course, that was not planned for. But took me into Buffalo, and I had surgery. There was an intracapsular fracture, and those have a very high percentage of not healing properly, and in those days they didn't have quite the techniques that they have now for replacing the hip, although they did some, but they, instead of the very fine prosthesis that they have now, they were mostly stainless steel at that time. However, they put a pin in, and it did heal, but after I left the hospital, I went to Wilma's and stayed there for the summer with her and Calvin, and her sister Carrie was there. The two of us in our wheelchairs had lots of fun. I could get behind her and give her a push sometimes, and we had lots of fun about our races. By fall, I was able to go about the house somewhat with my cane, but out on the ground I still had to use my crutches. Walter was held up by his job in the west and couldn't get back east as early as he had hoped for us to take the trip through New England, but eventually he came, and and we had this nice trip through New England. When we arrived back in Salamanca, it was getting to be pretty close to the 1st of December. I could get around much better, and felt that by the 1st of January I would be able to go into the office to work limited time. You see, the reason I couldn't get back to practice was the fact that I had to stand on my feet so much. And until I was able to do that, I was pretty much limited in what I could do. Walter had wanted to take a trip to Florida, and there was a certain boat trip that he wanted to take out of Fort Myers. He wanted me to go with him. And I said, well, I feel that I can get back to my practice by the 1st of January, and I feel that I should. It would soon be a year since I had fallen and had to be away. So finally I told him that I would go with him if he wanted to bring me back 1st of January. And we would drive my car, and so he immediately went to the telephone and called and made a reservation for the boat trip, and found that they had just 2 reservations left, and we had just time, without rushing too much, to get to Florida in order to get the first trip out of Fort Myers. Then we came back from there, and on that trip, arriving back in Fort Myers on Saturday morning, and we were going down to the Keys. We got down to Naples and decided that we would spend the weekend there. It was late Saturday afternoon when we arrived in Naples. Never had been there before, and we were quite impressed by the place. So Monday morning we went on down to Key West eventually, and back, and then we came back up to Greenville, South Carolina, where Whit and Patty, his son, was stationed with the Air Force, and we spent Christmas with them. Then he took me back to Salamanca, and I resumed practice there. For the next few winters, I would go down to Florida with him for a period of 2 or 3 months. And in the spring of, we went down for the winter of 61, 62, and 63. And in January, February, he said, you know, I would like to buy an old rundown place and have something to do to fix it up, just as an investment, and then sell it. I said, well, why don't you do it? And so he went out, looked at the newspaper, and then he went to see this real estate agent. And after a while, he came back, and he said, well, I found this place I was reading about, and it's just up the road here a couple of miles. He said, I have the key to it, and he said, do you want to go up and see it? Well, as we approached it and I saw it, I said, oh, Walter, no. It just was an old looked like an old run-down shack, and needed painting, and I just couldn't imagine him even considering such a place. And neighborhood, it was not a good neighborhood. Well, we went inside, and inside, except for the fact that it was very, very dirty, it was really a very pleasant place. Had 2 bedrooms, great big living room, extended clear across the front of the house, dining area, kitchen, and a back sun porch. So the man wanted $7,500 for it. And Walter said, well, I wouldn't think of paying him $7,500. It was so dilapidated and run down. So he told the real estate that he wouldn't even consider it. So the man came down a little more. I think around 5,500. And he said no. By this time, he'd just about made up his mind. He didn't know whether he really wanted to get it or not because there was going to be so much work to fix it. But finally, they wanted him to make an offer what he would pay for it. So he, if I recall correctly, he gave them an offer of $3,500. Now, it may have been 4,000, but I think it was 3,500. And by this time, he decided he didn't want it, and they took it. So we had to. He closed the deal. Well, then he started working up there. Well, as I say, it was so dirty we couldn't move into it, so we kept the little efficiency apartment that we had, and lived there. And then he'd drive up there in the morning, or I'd take him up, and then I'd go up at noontime and take him some lunch, and then maybe I'd work some, and by the time I felt that I had to go back to New York State Line, he had gotten it fixed well enough, cleaned up enough that he could go there and stay. He took me home, and then he went back again. Well, for the next 2 or 3 winters, that was where we lived, and he kept on fixing it until it really was a very attractive place, and the people around us started cleaning up their places. As one of the men said, you know, Mr. Wilcox, you make us sort of ashamed of our places, and they really had picked them up and fixed them up better.
Oh, that's good.
The Christmas of 1964, Charlie and Helen took me down. Walter was there. He had been back to Oregon during the summer, and then had gone back directly to Florida. So they took me down, and Whit and Patty and the girls came down from Camp Dix in New Jersey, and we were all there for Christmas. Well, the house hadn't been settled to such an extent that it was a real problem to try to cook the dinner and feed all that crowd for that length of time. But we had an awfully good time, while we were there, we had an interesting experience. Walter discovered that the First Methodist Church had purchased land over in East Naples quite some years before that, realizing that someday there was going to be the need of a church over there. And the time had come when they felt it was time to start organizing one. So they had started a Sunday school in the little health center there. It met early enough so that, and closed early enough so that the people who attended Sunday school could go over into Naples for the Sunday school class, or for the morning worship service. So when I went down, both of us started going to this little Sunday school. Well, it kept growing, and finally they felt that they just, if they wanted to get any further, they would just have to have a preacher. So a young man came who had been in business in Fort Myers, but had decided to go into the ministry, and he and his family moved down there, and to try to help to establish the new Methodist Church. As I think back, it was interesting. As I say, we met in the health center. If we had an attendance of 25 or 30 people, that was just a wonderful congregation and a wonderful Sunday school. We used the reception room for our sanctuary. The altar was a card table with a picture of Christ and a couple of candles on it. We had a little portable organ that, and no one who could play it very well. But there was one of the ladies that could play at it, and so she played the organ. And on Communion Sunday, we took one of the benches. Our benches didn't have any backs, so we used those for seats, of course. But we'd take one of these seats and take the cushion off from it and put it on the floor to kneel on, and then use the seat itself as our for communion to kneel at. The little church continued to grow, and the people from First Church thought that it was time that we use the land that they had purchased years before to start a new church. So they decided that they would build their fellowship hall first. And Walter did a great deal of the planning and looking after the building of this church, this fellowship hall. It served the purpose for everything that we wanted. We used it as a sanctuary on Sunday morning, and then during the week it was used for all of the social activities of the church, all of its meetings. And it was just such a close-knit little group, and we just thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was quite remarkable that Walter, at 84, 85, was able to go on and take charge of a lot of that construction work. The building would seat, by crowding them in, about 150 people. Since that time, his dream has come true. The new sanctuary has been built, and they now have a sanctuary that will seat about 400 people, and they have to have 3 services a Sunday during the tourist season when there are so many people there. I often wish that he could have seen how that developed. We remained there I retired completely in 1966 and went down. My retirement came so suddenly. In some ways it was easier than it would have been had I had more time to think about it. Walter became very ill, and so I had to leave more quickly than I had expected. And so the summer of 1977, or 1967, we spent in Florida. That's the only summer that I ever spent there for the entire summer. His health was not sufficiently good for us to go north, and so we remained there, living in this house that he had expected to sell, bought it just for an investment. In June of '69, he passed away, and so in 1970, I sold the place there and moved here to Irving, Texas, to be near Jim and Lee. And at first I lived in a mobile home in the Oakdale Mobile Home Park near Nimitz High School off of West Oakdale. Then in 1970, I sold that and moved into my little dollhouse on Jim's lot, so that I am very close. Or 1980, I sold it and moved there. this is a good place to take another break.